In a quiet neighborhood, a young black boy sees masked intruders breaking into an elderly white woman's home. What he does next, a brave act that risks his own safety, will leave you speechless and remind you of the power of courage and kindness. The quiet street, lined with old, weathered houses, had once been a lively neighborhood. Over the years, though, its vibrancy had faded, replaced by a sense of isolation. The gardens that had once been meticulously tended now bore overgrown weeds, and the sound of children playing had long since disappeared. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, shutting their doors as soon as dusk approached. Tyler, a spirited young boy with an easy smile and an unshakable curiosity, was one of the few bright spots on the street. He had a habit of helping neighbors with small tasks, whether it was carrying groceries for the elderly or tidying up a forgotten lawn. His kindness was well known, but he often felt like the street didn't return the favor. People rarely lingered outside, preferring the safety of their homes. One of the few residents Tyler was truly curious about was Mrs. Peterson. The elderly widow lived in the smallest house at the corner of the street, its shutters perpetually closed. She rarely came outside, except to retrieve the mail or water her sparse garden. Her demeanor was quiet, almost guarded, and Tyler often wondered about the life she led behind those closed doors. He had heard whispers from other neighbors about her reclusive nature, but he had never seen her as anything other than kind during their brief exchanges. Lately, though, Tyler had noticed something unsettling. Mrs. Peterson had begun locking her doors earlier than usual, sometimes even before sunset. A few nights ago, he had seen her peering cautiously out of her window, as though she were watching for something or someone. Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Adding to his unease, he had spotted unfamiliar figures lingering near the edges of the neighborhood, their movements too deliberate to be casual. Tyler didn't like the sense of unease that had crept over his once familiar street. As he walked past Mrs. Peterson's house that evening, he couldn't help but glance toward her windows, silently hoping everything was okay. The shadows around the corner seemed to grow longer, and the air felt heavier, as if the quiet neighborhood was bracing itself for something it couldn't quite name. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains of Tyler's room as he hopped out of bed, energized and ready for another day. It was a Saturday, and though most kids his age might have spent the morning glued to their screens, Tyler had other plans. He loved the quiet streets of his neighborhood. Even if they sometimes felt a little too quiet, Tyler began his day with a quick breakfast, then headed outside to check on a few of the older neighbors. His first stop was Mr. Jenkins' place, where he helped the elderly man retrieve a package that had been left on his porch. Tyler smiled as Mr. Jenkins handed him a small chocolate bar as thanks, a routine gesture that always brightened his day. From there, Tyler wandered to the small park near his street, greeting a few joggers and nodding politely to the occasional passerby. Though Tyler was well-liked, he wasn't blind to the occasional looks or murmurs he received. Some people saw him as just another kid from a struggling family, his dark skin and youthful exuberance a stark contrast to the mostly older, white residents who had lived there for decades. But Tyler didn't let it bother him. He believed actions spoke louder than words, and he made it a point to help wherever he could. One of the people Tyler kept an eye on was Mrs. Peterson. Her small house, tucked away at the end of the street, always seemed a little lonelier than the others. Tyler knew that she had lost her husband years ago, and though she rarely spoke of him, the way she kept his belongings perfectly arranged in the small flower-filled garden was a testament to her enduring love. Tyler often saw her sitting by the window, gazing out as if lost in thought, but she rarely ventured outside. When he waved to her from the sidewalk, she would nod politely, but there was always a hint of sadness in her eyes. That evening, Tyler returned from the park and decided to take his usual walk past Mrs. Peterson's house. Something about her solitude always tugged at him. Tonight, though, as he approached her home, he noticed something unusual. The lights in her house were dimmed, and the curtains were tightly drawn. His steps slowed as he scanned the quiet street. The shadows seemed darker than usual, and the faint sound of shuffling reached his ears. Peering toward Mrs. Peterson's porch, Tyler's breath caught. Two masked figures were crouched near the front door, their movements swift and deliberate. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he realized what was happening. They were breaking in. For a moment, Tyler froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what to do. The figures managed to force the door open, disappearing inside without a sound. Tyler's mind raced. Should he run for help? Call the police? The image of Mrs. Peterson, sitting quietly in her chair, filled his mind. She was alone, defenseless. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Swallowing his fear, Tyler reached for his phone and dialed 911. His hands trembled as he whispered into the receiver, describing the situation to the operator. 2 men. They just broke into my neighbor's house. I think she's inside. Please send help. The operator assured him that officers were on their way, but Tyler couldn't bring himself to wait. What if Mrs. Peterson needed help now? What if the robbers heard her before the police arrived? He couldn't live with himself if something happened to her while he stood outside, doing nothing. Tyler clenched his fists, summoning every ounce of courage he had. He crept toward the house, staying low to avoid being seen. His heart pounded in his ears as he approached the side window. Peeking through a small gap in the curtains, he saw Mrs. Peterson in her living room. She was sitting in her armchair, her face pale and fearful, while one of the masked men loomed over her, shouting demands. The other was rifling through drawers, tossing papers and belongings onto the floor. A wave of anger surged through Tyler. Mrs. Peterson had always seemed so fragile, so alone. Seeing her in danger ignited something in him. He couldn't just stand by. He had to act. Gripping his phone tightly, Tyler whispered an update to the 911 operator. They're still inside. They've got her in the living room. Please hurry. The operator urged him to stay outside and wait for the police, but Tyler knew he couldn't. Mrs. Peterson didn't have time. Summoning his courage, he looked around the yard for anything he could use. His eyes landed on a small garden hoe leaning against the side of the house. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Tyler took a deep breath and slipped through the back door, which had been left ajar by the intruders. The house was eerily quiet except for the muffled voices in the living room. He could hear Mrs. Peterson pleading softly, her voice trembling with fear. Tyler gritted his teeth and moved closer, his heart pounding louder with every step. As he peered around the corner, he saw one of the robbers pacing angrily, while the other continued rummaging through the drawers. Mrs. Peterson sat frozen in her chair, her hands clutching the armrests. Tyler knew he couldn't wait any longer. With a deep breath, he knocked over a nearby lamp, sending it crashing to the floor. The noise startled the robbers, who spun around, momentarily distracted. Tyler used the opportunity to shout, "The police are on their way. You'd better leave now." The robbers exchanged panicked glances, and for a moment, it seemed they might flee. But one of them advanced toward Tyler, his expression menacing. Tyler held his ground, gripping the garden hoe tightly. Just as the man reached for him, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The robbers froze, their escape cut off as flashing blue and red lights illuminated the street outside. Tyler felt a surge of relief as the police stormed the house, guns drawn. The officers quickly subdued the robbers, handcuffing them and escorting them out of the house. Tyler sank to his knees, his adrenaline fading as relief washed over him. Mrs. Peterson, her face streaked with tears, rose shakily from her chair and made her way to Tyler. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved my life." Tyler looked up at her, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's okay, Mrs. Peterson. I couldn't let anything happen to you." The weight of the moment hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. Tyler's bravery had not only saved Mrs. Peterson but had also rekindled a sense of hope in a neighborhood that had long forgotten what it meant to stand together. The air inside Mrs. Peterson's house was suffocatingly tense. Tyler crept in through the back door, his every nerve on edge. The muffled sounds of shouting echoed from the living room, each word sending a chill down his spine. He clutched the garden hoe tightly, his hands trembling as he moved quietly through the dimly lit hallway. Every step felt like an eternity, the creak of the old wooden floors threatening to give him away. He peeked around the corner and saw Mrs. Peterson sitting in her armchair, her face pale and her body trembling. One of the robbers, a tall man with a mask covering his face, stood over her, yelling angrily as she shook her head in fear. The other intruder was rummaging through drawers and cabinets, throwing items onto the floor in frustration. Papers, photo frames, and small trinkets littered the room, the chaos a stark contrast to the usually tidy space Mrs. Peterson kept. Tyler ducked back into the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly pulled out his phone and whispered an update to the 911 operator. "They're still here. One of them is yelling at her, and the other one is looking for stuff. Please, hurry." The operator's voice was calm and reassuring, but Tyler knew time was slipping away. The robbers weren't just looking for valuables. They were terrifying Mrs. Peterson, and he couldn't stand by any longer. He had to do something. As he ended the call, his eyes darted around the hallway, searching for a way to distract the men. His gaze fell on a small table nearby, its contents precariously balanced. Tyler swallowed hard and gave it a sharp shove, sending it crashing to the floor. The noise was deafening in the otherwise quiet house. "What was that?" One of the robbers barked, spinning around. The other froze mid-search, his head snapping toward the hallway. Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened, a flicker of hope flashing across her face as the robbers turned their attention away from her. Tyler quickly ducked behind a nearby doorway, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure they could hear it. The men exchanged tense glances, then split up, one heading toward the kitchen and the other cautiously approaching the hallway. Tyler crouched low, holding his breath as the man moved closer. He could see the shadow of the intruder's feet from his hiding spot and knew it was only a matter of time before he was discovered. Thinking quickly, he grabbed a nearby vase and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the far wall, drawing the man's attention away. "What's going on in here?" the robber shouted, his voice rising with agitation. Tyler used the distraction to sneak back toward the living room, where Mrs. Peterson remained seated, her eyes locked on the chaos unfolding around her. Tyler caught her gaze and motioned for her to move toward the back door. At first, she hesitated, her fear paralyzing her. But Tyler's determined expression seemed to give her the courage she needed. Slowly, she began to rise, her movements careful and deliberate. The other robber, still searching through drawers, noticed her movement and barked, "Where do you think you're going? Sit back down." He started toward her, but Tyler stepped out from his hiding place, raising the garden hoe like a weapon. "Leave her alone," Tyler shouted, his voice shaking but resolute. The man froze for a moment, startled by the sudden appearance of the boy. Then he smirked, his eyes narrowing as he took a step toward Tyler. "What do we have here? A little hero?" Tyler's grip on the garden hoe tightened. He knew he didn't stand a chance against the larger man, but he also knew he couldn't back down. "The police are on their way," Tyler said, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. "You should leave now while you still can." The robber laughed, a cold and mocking sound that sent chills down Tyler's spine. "Nice try, kid, but I don't think so." Just as the man lunged toward Tyler, Mrs. Peterson seized the moment. With surprising speed, she grabbed a heavy lamp from the side table and swung it at the other intruder, catching him off guard. The impact sent him stumbling, giving Tyler the opening he needed. Tyler swung the garden hoe with all his strength, aiming for the man's legs. The blow landed with a dull thud, causing the robber to stagger backward and lose his balance. Tyler quickly stepped between Mrs. Peterson and the intruder, his stance protective despite the overwhelming danger. "You've got one chance to leave," Tyler said, his voice steady now, "or you'll regret it." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension, their wailing a beacon of hope. The robbers froze, their confidence evaporating as the realization hit them. They exchanged panicked glances, their earlier bravado replaced by fear. "Cops," one of them hissed. "We've gotta go." before they could make their escape, the front door burst open, and the police stormed in, their weapons drawn. "Freeze! Hands where we can see them!" an officer shouted. The robbers raised their hands reluctantly, their faces contorted with frustration as they were quickly handcuffed and escorted out of the house. Tyler lowered the garden hoe, his arms trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. He turned to Mrs. Peterson, who was still clutching the lamp, her face pale but determined. "It's over," Tyler said softly, offering her a reassuring smile. Mrs. Peterson's eyes filled with tears as she set the lamp down and stepped toward him. "You saved my life," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to thank you." Tyler shook his head, a small, humble smile on his face. "You don't have to, Mrs. Peterson. I just did what anyone should do." The police officers, now finished securing the scene, approached Tyler, one of them placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're a brave kid," the officer said. "You kept your cool and saved someone's life tonight. Not many people would have done what you did." Tyler nodded, his gaze returning to Mrs. Peterson. The moment felt surreal, the events of the night catching up to him all at once. But despite the fear and danger, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. He had done the right thing, and that was all that mattered. The flashing red and blue lights painted the dark street in a surreal glow as the police rushed into the house, their commanding voices echoing through the chaos. The robbers, realizing their escape was cut off, tried to make a break for it, but the officers moved with precision, blocking every possible route. One of the intruders raised his hands in surrender, while the other hesitated, still clinging to some false hope of escape. Within moments, both men were handcuffed and escorted out of the house. Tyler stood frozen in the middle of the living room, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to wear off. His arms ached from gripping the garden hoe so tightly, and a shallow cut on his forearm stung from where he had scraped it during the confrontation. But his eyes were fixed on Mrs. Peterson, who was still seated in her chair, trembling but alive. The sight of her safe and unharmed filled him with a deep sense of relief. An officer approached Tyler, placing a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did good, kid," he said, his tone filled with genuine admiration. "We've got it from here. You're a brave one." Tyler nodded, his gaze still on Mrs. Peterson. Slowly, she rose from her chair, her frail hands gripping the armrests for support. Her face, lined with years of quiet resilience, now bore fresh streaks of tears. She took a shaky step toward Tyler, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. "Tyler," she whispered, her voice breaking. You saved me." Before Tyler could respond, Mrs. Peterson broke down, covering her face with her hands as sobs racked her body. It was a side of her he had never seen before, a vulnerability that made her seem so much more human, so much more real. She reached out for him, and Tyler stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her in a comforting hug. He could feel her shaking against him, her gratitude pouring out in waves. "You're my hero," she managed to say between sobs. "You're my hero, Tyler." Tyler held her tightly, his own emotions threatening to spill over. He had acted on instinct, driven by a need to protect someone who couldn't protect herself. In that moment, hearing her words, he realized just how much it had meant. Outside, the commotion had drawn the attention of the neighbors. Porch lights flicked on one by one, and soon a small crowd had gathered on the street, murmuring among themselves as they tried to piece together what had happened. Whispers of Tyler's bravery spread quickly, and before long, people were approaching the house, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the young boy who had saved Mrs. Peterson. The officers stepped out to address the gathering crowd, explaining the events and confirming that everyone was safe. When Tyler finally emerged from the house, he was met with a wave of applause and cheers. The neighbors, many of whom had never taken the time to truly know him, were now looking at him with newfound respect and admiration. One elderly man approached him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You're a brave young man," he said. "This neighborhood could use more people like you." Tyler felt a mix of pride and shyness at the attention. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but he could see the genuine appreciation in their faces. For once, he didn't feel like an outsider. The invisible barriers that had kept him at arm's length from his community seemed to dissolve in that moment. As the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Peterson stepped outside, her small frame illuminated by the glow of the porch light. She held something in her hands, a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth with age. She approached Tyler with a mixture of hesitance and determination, her tears now replaced with a soft, grateful smile. "This belonged to my husband," she said, her voice steady despite the lingering emotion. "He kept it with him during his time in the Navy. It was always a symbol of strength and courage for him. And now I want you to have it." Tyler looked down at the box, his eyes widening. He hesitated, unsure if he could accept such a meaningful gift. "Mrs. Peterson, I can't take this. It's yours." Mrs. Peterson shook her head, placing the box in his hands. "No, Tyler. It's yours now. You've earned it. You reminded me tonight of the kind of strength he always believed in. Thank you for saving me." Tyler nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He opened the box carefully and found a small medal inside, its edges slightly tarnished but its significance unmistakable. It was an honor bestowed on her husband for his bravery during his service. Tyler held it reverently, feeling the weight of not just the medal but the trust and gratitude that came with it. As the night quieted and the street emptied, Tyler and Mrs. Peterson sat together on her porch steps, the events of the evening settling into their minds. For the first time in years, Mrs. Peterson felt truly seen, not just as the reclusive widow on the corner, but as someone who mattered. And for Tyler, the feeling of having made a real difference filled him with a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. Their bond, forged in the crucible of danger and courage, was unbreakable. The neighborhood had seen a glimpse of what true bravery and kindness looked like, and it was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Mrs. Peterson placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled. A genuine, heartfelt smile that spoke of hope, healing, and gratitude. The cool night air wrapped around Tyler as he walked home, the faint hum of crickets filling the quiet streets. His hands were tucked into his pockets, his mind replaying the events of the evening like a vivid reel. The danger, the fear, the adrenaline. It all felt like a blur now. But as he replayed each moment, a deep sense of pride swelled within him. He had acted on instinct, not out of recklessness, but because he couldn't stand the thought of Mrs. Peterson being hurt or scared. Tyler's steps slowed as he neared his house, the weight of it all settling in. He had always believed in doing the right thing, but tonight had proven just how much one small, brave act could mean. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about being there when someone needed help, about stepping up even when it was terrifying. He glanced down at the small wooden box Mrs. Peterson had given him, the medal inside a tangible reminder of the courage he had shown. It was humbling to know that someone trusted him with something so precious. Across the street, a porch light flickered on, and an elderly neighbor waved at him. Tyler waved back, realizing how much had shifted in just a few hours. The community that had once felt distant, even indifferent, now seemed to see him in a different light. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were starting to feel like a collective, like people who looked out for one another. In the days that followed, the change became even more apparent. Mrs. Peterson, who had always kept to herself, was now a familiar presence on her front porch. She waved at passers-by, sometimes even striking up conversations with those who lingered. Her bond with Tyler grew deeper as well. She invited him over for tea, sharing stories about her late husband and her life before the quiet solitude of widowhood. To Tyler, she wasn't just the elderly lady at the end of the street anymore. She was family. Word of Tyler's bravery spread through the neighborhood, and his story became something of a local legend. People spoke of the young boy who had risked everything to save Mrs. Peterson, the boy who had reminded them of the importance of looking out for one another. His actions inspired subtle but meaningful changes. Neighbors who had once been content to stay behind closed doors now stopped to greet each other. Porch lights stayed on a little longer, and people became more attuned to the goings-on in their community. One afternoon, As Tyler walked past a group of kids playing basketball on the street, one of them stopped and called out, "Hey Tyler, you're the guy who saved Mrs. Peterson, right?" Tyler smiled and nodded, feeling a mix of embarrassment and pride. "That was awesome," the kid added, giving him a thumbs up before returning to the game. The recognition was nice, but what mattered most to Tyler was knowing that he had made a difference. Not just for Mrs. Peterson, but for everyone in the neighborhood. His bravery had sparked something bigger, something that went beyond a single heroic act. It had reminded people of the power of kindness, of the importance of standing up for what's right. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Tyler sat on his porch steps, watching the world around him. The street was still quiet, but it no longer felt lonely. He could hear the faint sound of laughter coming from a nearby house, the murmur of a conversation from another. It wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a community, one where people cared about one another. Tyler smiled to himself, the wooden box resting beside him. He knew that life would move on, that new challenges would come, but this moment, this transformation, was something he would carry with him forever. It wasn't just about what he had done for Mrs. Peterson. It was about what they had done for each other and how, in the process, they had reminded an entire street of the power of courage and connection. As the evening settled into a peaceful calm, the neighborhood felt transformed. Tyler's act of courage wasn't just a story about bravery. It was a story about the power of humanity to bridge divides. His selfless decision to step in and help Mrs. Peterson wasn't just about protecting a vulnerable neighbor. It was about showing what it truly means to care for one another, regardless of differences in age, race, or background. Mrs. Peterson, once isolated and withdrawn, now felt a renewed connection to the world around her. Her bond with Tyler was a testament to the idea that kindness has no boundaries. She often found herself reflecting on how one boy's bravery had not only saved her life but had also reignited her trust in people. It wasn't just her life that had been changed. It was her heart. The story of Tyler and Mrs. Peterson became a beacon for the entire neighborhood. It reminded people of the importance of looking out for one another, of breaking through stereotypes and assumptions, and of choosing compassion over indifference. In a world that sometimes feels divided, their story stood as proof that small actions could create ripples of change. Tyler's bravery inspires a simple yet profound question. What would you do if faced with the opportunity to help someone in need? His actions show that courage doesn't have to be loud or grand. It can be quiet and instinctive, born from a desire to do what's right. If this story touched your heart, let it inspire you to make a difference. Share this story with your friends and family. Leave a comment about a moment when kindness or bravery changed your life or someone else's. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep spreading stories of hope and humanity. Together, let's create a world where compassion is the norm and courage lights the way.